South from San Diego in late June of 1942 steamed a heavily guarded convoy of transports, supply ships, and warcraft. It was carrying troops of the 1st Marine Division, the finest fighting force in the United States. Their secret objective was the Solomon Islands, where the entrenched Japanese were dangerously close to the U.S. supply line to Australia. By dawn on August 7th, after preliminary bombardment by the surface vessels, the 1st Marine Battalion swarmed ashore on Guadalcanal and Tulagi. Bridgeheads were established and held on both islands. Then began one of the most desperate campaigns in the history of the Marine Corps. For supplies, the U.S. fighting men depended to a great extent on what they had seized from the Japs. Time and again, though heavily outnumbered, they threw back the attacks of picked Japanese troops with terrific losses. Supporting naval units repeatedly blasted Japanese sea forces, attempting to land reinforcements on Guadalcanal. The battle-hardened U.S. Navy was showing the standards of gunnery, daring, and leadership that had long been its proud tradition. This series of attacks culminated in the memorable night engagements of November 1942, when warships slugged it out with each other in the darkness. The decisive beating given the Japanese, who lost 11 warships and 12 auxiliaries, marked the end of their advance, the beginning of their retreat. And with the enemy checkmated in the Pacific, the United States was ready at last to take up the offensive it had long been planning in another theater. The invasion of North Africa by forces which had to be ferried over as much as 3,000 miles of ocean was to be one of the biggest landing operations in the history of warfare. Upon the U.S. Navy, now rebuilt and expanded to greater strength than ever before, fell the responsibility for transporting in safety hundreds of thousands of men and all their equipment, a task accomplished without the loss of a single life. The heavy firepower of the Navy's guns immobilized enemy warships, neutralized shore batteries, and gave protection to the landing forces. In the war's first big and clean-cut American victory on land, the Navy and the Army had achieved a triumph of joint planning, organization, and execution. And it was the mounting flood of materials and manpower which the Navy continued to deliver through the Nazi submarine blockade that paved the way for new and smashing Allied victories in the Atlantic theater. Within a few months, the counterattacking Red Army was to wipe out all of the Nazis' 1942 advances, and the British drive begun at Alamein was to culminate in the great victory of Tunisia. By spring of 1943, the Allied High Command knew that the time was near for which all that had gone before was but a preparation, the invasion of Europe and the great offensive against Japan in the Pacific. And to back up the invading forces, there now existed a new and ever-growing U.S. Navy, incomparably bigger and more powerful than the old. A Navy already valiantly in action on all the seas of the world, from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean, from the Arctic to the South Pacific. Still coming down the ways of hundreds of American shipyards every day were combat vessels of every type. Great ships like the Iowa and New Jersey, unmatched in speed, firepower, and armor. Giant aircraft carriers and fast cruisers. Tiny PT boats that so heroically proved their worth off Bataan and Guadalcanal. The American Navy, as in the day of John Paul Jones, had just begun to fight. Now at last, there were ships and guns for fighting men who, through hard and crucial months, had had to do so much with so little. Not yet is the worldwide battle won that began in the catastrophe of December 1941. But today the men of the Navy know that theirs is no longer a desperate battle against defeat, but an affirmative battle, confident and determined, a battle for final and inevitable victory.